The night air was heavy with the weight of expectation, and though the desert was vast and unbroken in every direction, every man on the combat control team knew exactly where their focus lay. On the rookie, the girl who had been placed among them not because anyone thought she would thrive, but because someone high above had insisted she be given the chance. Her name was Elena Reyes, a 22-year-old who had never once been tested outside a training environment, never once been trusted with the lives of men who depended on radio precision, never once been asked to keep her heart steady when the storm of battle pressed in. And yet here she was, strapped into her gear, her headset snug against her ears, her eyes wide with the same mixture of fear and determination that every veteran recognized but would never admit they had once carried themselves. To her left stood Master Sergeant Keller, the team leader, a man of 37 with a voice like gravel and a mind like clockwork, who believed in nothing more sacred than the reliability of the men, and now women, under his command. He had not wanted her here. He had not asked for her. But orders were orders, and as far as Keller was concerned, if she could pull her weight, then she would be welcome, and if she could not, then she would be nothing more than a liability they would have to drag across the sand. The mission was a live test of her skill, a simple reconnaissance that should have been straightforward but, like all things in this unforgiving place, had a way of twisting into something more dangerous, something that asked more from the body and the mind than any simulation back in the States ever could. At precisely 0200 hours they began the long trek across the dunes, their boots sinking softly into the shifting grains, their silhouettes blending into the horizon, the rookie's breathing uneven at first, then steadying as she found her rhythm, every step reminding her that this was not practice anymore, this was the crucible where respect was either earned or lost forever. The first kilometers passed in silence, the kind that spoke louder than words, each man conserving his energy, each mind focused on the weight of the task ahead. Elena carried her pack like the rest, though it felt heavier with every rise and fall of the sand beneath her, the radio strapped across her back an anchor that seemed determined to test her resolve. She knew the frequencies, she knew the procedures, she knew the cadence of call signs and the discipline of brevity, but knowledge written in manuals meant nothing under the stars where the nearest help was hours away and a single mistake could scatter the fragile thread of trust that tied her to these hardened warriors. At her first stumble, when the sand slipped beneath her boot and she fell to one knee, she felt the eyes of the men on her back, not in cruelty but in judgment, waiting to see whether she would rise without complaint. And rise she did, forcing herself upright, adjusting the strap digging into her shoulder, moving again with a determination that was not perfect but was hers. Keller noticed, though he said nothing, for words of encouragement were luxuries never handed to rookies, and especially not to rookies who were here because someone outside the team believed in ideals rather than performance. The moon hung like a pale lantern overhead, and in its cold glow Elena tried to steady her heartbeat, to measure her breaths, to remind herself that this was the chance she had been begging for. Every story she had ever heard of these men, their endurance, their ruthlessness, their ability to disappear into the chaos of battle and re-emerge with victory, was now pressing against her shoulders, and she understood with clarity that if she faltered, her failure would not belong to her alone but would be written into the story of the whole team. By the time they had reached the ridge that marked the first third of their march, Elena's legs burned as if coals had been pressed beneath her skin. She tried to think of numbers, of the distance markers Keller had murmured during the briefing. 3,300 meters to cover under load, a test not of speed but of discipline, a distance chosen because it revealed who could master their mind and who would collapse under the weight of fatigue. The veterans moved with the steady patience of men who had walked further under worse conditions, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of endurance, while Elena, though athletic in training, now found herself forced to draw on reserves she had never touched before. The sand shifted with each step, dragging her backwards as much as forwards, and yet she refused to slow, refused to let the gap between her and the rest widen into failure. When Keller finally raised his hand and signaled a halt, she nearly collapsed with relief, sinking down to one knee not in weakness but in the ritual of conserving strength, her lungs heaving as she pulled the canteen to her lips. The water was lukewarm, metallic against her tongue, but it revived her just enough to hold her upright. Around her, the men drank in silence, their eyes on the horizon, their discipline unbroken, as though the desert itself was watching and would punish any display of fragility. Keller's gaze drifted across the team and finally settled on Elena, not unkind but measuring, weighing, as though deciding whether the rookie would last the night. She met his eyes only for a moment before looking away, her cheeks flushed with heat and pride, unwilling to ask for approval, unwilling to seek comfort in a glance, determined to carry herself forward no matter what his judgment might be. The march resumed, and this time the silence felt heavier, the desert swallowing every sound except the crunch of boots and the faint hiss of wind. Elena's mind began to wander despite her efforts to anchor it, and memories of training surfaced. Nights spent in the radio room memorizing frequencies, drills that demanded she switch channels under simulated fire, the constant pressure of instructors who told her she would never match the endurance of the men who had lived through combat. She remembered the sting of those words, the quiet fire they had lit in her chest, and now, step by step, she carried that fire like a shield. When Keller called for her to check in with command, she nearly fumbled with the handset, her hands clumsy with sweat and exhaustion, but she caught herself, steadied her grip, and delivered the call with clarity, her voice calm, precise, the message relayed without error. The acknowledgement from command crackled through her headset, a small confirmation that she had not failed, that she had, in that moment, proven at least a fraction of her worth. No one said anything when she handed the handset back to her own harness, but in the silence she sensed a shift, subtle, like the air before dawn, as if the men had noted her steadiness and were quietly adjusting their measure of her. She did not smile, did not allow herself the indulgence of triumph, for the march was far from over, and the desert was merciless to those who celebrated too soon. As the kilometers stretched behind them, fatigue became a constant companion, whispering doubts into her mind, tugging at her resolve with every step. She thought of her father then, a mechanic who had worked 12-hour shifts in a garage and had never once complained, who had told her that respect was not something given but something earned through the grind of consistency. His voice seemed to echo across the desert now, reminding her that every step, every breath, was part of the proof she had to lay before these men. The rookie radio operator who had entered this mission with nothing but suspicion on her shoulders now carried within her the weight of that lesson, and with each meter she closed the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. When the final ridge loomed ahead, marking the end of the 3,300 meters, she could scarcely feel her legs, her arms numb from the pack, her throat raw from the desert air, but she forced herself onward, counting each step, each heartbeat, until at last the team crested the ridge and Keller called the march complete. Elena dropped to her knees, gasping, her body screaming for rest, but her mind alive with a strange, fierce joy. She had done it, she had walked every meter without breaking, without falling behind, without surrendering to the weight of doubt. And though no one cheered, though no one offered her a hand or a word of praise, she saw in their eyes the glimmer of acknowledgement, the quiet, unspoken respect that was the only currency that mattered here. Keller crouched beside her, his face unreadable in the pale light, his voice low and steady as he said, "Not bad, rookie. Not bad at all." And though the words were few, they were heavier than any metal, for they carried with them the weight of acceptance, the first crack in the wall of doubt that had surrounded her since she joined. Elena nodded, too exhausted to speak, but inside her chest her heart thundered with pride, not just for having survived the march, but for having proven, if only for one night, that she belonged among them. The desert did not grant them much time to bask in quiet victories, for missions moved like currents, one objective pulling into the next, and the team was already reorienting themselves toward their primary task, an observation post on the ridge overlooking a valley that intelligence had marked as a likely transit route for hostile elements. Elena had only moments to catch her breath before she found herself once again under the silent, relentless rhythm of the combat control team, men who moved like shadows across the landscape, efficient, wordless, each one knowing his place as if the desert itself had instructed them. She shouldered her pack, every muscle aching from the march, but when Keller gave the signal, she stepped forward with them, no hesitation in her stride. She had passed the physical test of distance, but she knew the real trial was only beginning. For the first time, her role as radio operator would mean more than practice signals and classroom drills. It would mean tethering the team to the unseen eyes and ears beyond the horizon, the command that guided them, the aircraft that might one day save them. Every word she spoke into her headset from this point forward would matter, and every silence she held too long could carve the line between survival and catastrophe. The valley stretched out below them like a wound in the earth, its edges jagged with rock, its depths shadowed even under the pale moonlight. Keller motioned for the team to establish their observation post, and within minutes, gear was unpacked, scopes mounted, camouflage nets stretched tight against the sand. Elena's place was behind a low rise where she could maintain radio contact without being exposed. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over as she set up the equipment, checked frequencies, confirmed encryption. Still, her heart raced with the knowledge that this was no longer training. If her signal faltered, if her voice broke, it would not be a red mark on a report card but a failure with consequences far larger than herself. Keller crouched beside her briefly, his eyes sharp as he asked for confirmation. She gave it, her voice steady, and he nodded once, moving on to the others. The unspoken approval made her pulse quicken, but she forced herself back into composure. This was her duty, and duty left no room for self-indulgence. Hours passed in the stillness of observation, the team watching, waiting, each man disciplined enough to withstand the boredom that would have driven lesser soldiers restless. Elena learned the rhythm quickly, long silences punctuated by the occasional whisper, the faint click of a scope adjusting, the quiet rustle of a canteen unscrewing. She remained at her station, headset snug, relaying brief status reports to command at timed intervals, her voice always calm, always clipped, each syllable measured. Yet as the hours drew on, fatigue began to creep in, a gnawing fog at the edge of her mind, threatening to dull her focus. She remembered the instructor's warnings during training. Fatigue is the enemy of precision, and precision is the lifeline of a team. She fought against the heaviness in her eyelids by cycling through mental drills, reciting call signs in her head, visualizing frequencies, reminding herself that she could not afford the luxury of weariness. It was during one of those quiet moments, when the desert seemed to have fallen entirely asleep, that movement flickered in the valley below. A shadow, faint and wavering, crept along the ridge line opposite them. Keller's hand raised instantly, the universal command for silence, though no one had been speaking. Every scope trained in the same direction, every breath seemed to pause. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears, but she leaned closer to her radio, ready to transmit. Through the dim haze, figures began to emerge, 2, then 4, then more, a column of men moving in silence, their shapes distorted by distance but their intent clear. This was no nomadic caravan, no harmless patrol. These were armed fighters, their weapons catching the moonlight as they shifted across the valley floor. Keller gave Elena the signal with a curt motion, and she keyed her handset, whispering the coded message to command, her words precise even as her throat tightened with adrenaline. The acknowledgement came quickly, distant voices calm in her ear, and she relayed Keller's updates in turn, translating his hand signals into clipped, efficient transmissions. The rookie who had once stumbled in sand was now the single thread binding the team to the larger operation, and though her body trembled, her voice carried no trace of fear. Keller noticed. He always noticed. The column below halted briefly, spreading out in loose formation as if sensing the eyes above them, and for a moment the valley was a tense chessboard where each side waited for the other to move. Elena held her breath, listening as command directed them to maintain observation but not engage. It was a delicate balance. Too soon and they risked revealing their position. Too late, and the enemy could vanish into the desert or stumble directly upon them. Keller's hand tapped Elena's shoulder lightly, his signal to relay updated coordinates, and she did so without hesitation, her pen scratching across her notebook as she tracked positions, her voice steady as she sent the grid references over the encrypted channel. It was tedious, nerve-wracking work, the kind of task where one slip of a digit could send air support to the wrong place, but she handled it with the discipline of someone who knew failure was not an option. Her throat was dry, her palms slick with sweat beneath her gloves, but when she finished the transmission, Keller gave the faintest nod before returning to his scope. It was a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, but to Elena it was a validation greater than any medal. She was proving herself, inch by inch, word by word. The hours dragged on, the fighters below moving sporadically, sometimes halting as if in debate, sometimes shifting as though guided by a hidden purpose. Elena's voice carried every update, her pen recording every movement, her headset linking the unseen world above to the silent eyes on the ground. The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders heavier than any pack, but she bore it with a steadiness that surprised even herself. When command finally instructed the team to prepare for extraction, Keller passed the signal down the line, and Elena relayed the acknowledgement, her voice crisp even as relief surged through her. The operation had been long, grueling, but they had maintained discipline, gathered intelligence, and remained undetected. As they packed their gear, Keller gave her a look, longer this time, deliberate. No words passed between them, but she understood. She had done her job. She had not only endured but had contributed, had become part of the rhythm rather than an outsider stumbling to keep pace. The march back to the rally point was no easier than the first, but this time, though her legs still ached and her lungs still burned, she carried with her a different weight, the knowledge that she had earned, however slightly, the respect of the men beside her. And that respect was a fire far brighter than fatigue. When at last the extraction team met them, when the hum of engines cut through the desert silence and the team climbed aboard the waiting vehicle, Elena felt the exhaustion crash down upon her in full. She sank into the seat, her pack at her feet, her radio still snug against her chest, and for the first time allowed her body to sag against the strain. Around her, the veterans settled with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to fatigue, their faces unreadable, their silence heavy but not unkind. Keller sat opposite her, his eyes closed, but when the vehicle jolted into motion, he opened them briefly and fixed her with a look that spoke more than words. Approval, acceptance, acknowledgement that she had done more than simply survive. She met his gaze, gave the faintest nod, and then closed her eyes, the desert fading behind her, the roar of the engine carrying her into the unknown future. She was no longer just the rookie radio operator. She was part of them now, tested in sand and silence, her voice the thread that had held the team steady across 3,300 meters of trial. The respect she had come seeking was not given freely, but tonight she had taken her first step toward truly earning it, and she knew with unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning. The return from their first operation together should have been a moment of release, a time when the rookie could finally exhale and allow her muscles to recover, but the world she had stepped into did not grant long respites. Barely 2 nights after the Ridge mission, the combat control team was reassigned to a forward operating site deeper into contested territory. The outpost itself was little more than a scattering of prefabricated shelters set against a canyon wall, an austere place built for necessity, not comfort, where every man carried the weight of vigilance and every sound beyond the perimeter wire demanded attention. Elena followed the team into this new environment with a quiet determination, her body still sore from the previous march, but her mind sharpened by the memory of what she had endured and what she had proven. The respect she had glimpsed in Keller's eyes was like a seed taking root, and though it was fragile, though it could wither with one mistake, she nurtured it with the discipline she had promised herself she would never break. As the days unfolded, her duties expanded beyond transmissions. She became responsible for maintaining the equipment, ensuring the encryption keys were updated, and verifying that each channel remained clear of interference. It was unglamorous, unseen work, the kind that rarely made it into stories, but within the team it was vital, and Keller, though sparing with words, noticed her consistency. The men too began to shift subtly around her. Where once they had regarded her with suspicion, they now moved with an ease that suggested she was no longer a stranger among them but a link in the chain, as crucial as any rifle or scope. But acceptance within the wire was only the beginning, and the desert outside had its own trials waiting. On the 4th night, Command ordered the team on a reconnaissance deeper than any Elena had yet experienced, an infiltration toward a cluster of villages rumored to shelter hostile elements. The route was brutal, winding through broken terrain where jagged rocks sliced at boots and loose scree slid beneath each step. The march began at dusk, the heat of the day fading into the chill of night, and Elena once again shouldered her pack, the familiar ache returning but no longer shaking her resolve. She kept pace, her breath controlled, her mind focused on the rhythm of movement. The men no longer watched her with doubt, they watched only the terrain, trusting her now to keep stride without faltering. Keller moved at the front, his silhouette a steady guide against the dim stars, his pace relentless but calculated. Hours passed like whispers, and Elena found herself falling into a strange clarity, her body on autopilot while her senses stretched outward, absorbing every detail of the desert night, the smell of dust, the crunch of gravel, the whisper of wind against stone. It was exhausting, yes, but also intoxicating in a way she had not anticipated, for with each step she felt herself being stripped of the rookie she had once been and remade into something sharper, harder, truer. By midnight they reached the observation point, a rocky ledge that overlooked the cluster of villages below. The team settled into silence, setting up their scopes, their positions, their gear. Elena found her place beside Keller, her radio already active, her notebook open. Below them, faint lights glimmered in the darkness. Fires, lanterns, the glow of electricity stolen from some generator. The village seemed peaceful from a distance, but the intelligence reports told a different story, of fighters moving through the alleys, of weapons cached in homes, of children used as shields. Elena tried to push those images from her mind, focusing instead on her task, her pen scratching as she recorded each observation. Hours slipped by and fatigue once again tested her, gnawing at the edges of her focus. Yet she did not falter. When Keller leaned close to murmur updates, she translated his words into transmissions with precision, her voice steady even when her hands trembled from the cold. Each report sent back to command was a stitch in the fabric of the mission, and she wove it carefully, deliberately, knowing the cost of error. It was near dawn when the mission shifted. Movement stirred in the village, vehicles emerging from narrow alleys, armed men loading supplies, the unmistakable pattern of a convoy preparing to depart. Keller's eyes narrowed behind his scope, and his hand tapped Elena's arm, the signal to relay. She keyed the radio, her voice sharp as she transmitted the update, her notebook filling with coordinates. Command responded almost instantly, their tone urgent, instructing the team to maintain eyes and prepare for potential close air support. Elena's chest tightened at the words. This was no longer a passive watch. This was the threshold where observation could collapse into combat, where her transmissions might guide not just reports but strikes that would leave fire across the valley floor. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her voice, to remember that she was the bridge between what Keller saw and what Command needed to act. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. And when the convoy began to roll, she was ready. Her words flowed crisp, carrying grid references, movement directions, numbers of vehicles. She tracked them relentlessly, her pen racing across the page, her voice a metronome of information. The first aircraft checked in overhead minutes later, the distant rumble of engines like thunder beyond the stars. Elena's heart leapt at the sound, her training flashing in her mind, how to handle multiple channels, how to coordinate between ground and sky, how to ensure clarity under the crush of adrenaline. Keller signaled for her to take the call, and without hesitation she did, her voice threading through the static with the confidence she had cultivated in every sleepless night of drills. The pilot responded, calm and professional, and for the first time Elena felt the full gravity of her role. She was not just speaking into a void but connecting two worlds, guiding death and salvation with her words. The convoy moved, the aircraft tracked, and she was the conductor of that fragile symphony, her every syllable measured against the stakes of lives unseen. Keller gave her coordinates, she relayed them, the pilot acknowledged, the chain unbroken. Her nerves trembled but her voice never cracked. She was becoming, in this crucible, what she had always dreamed to be. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the radio sputtered with interference. Static burst through her headset, drowning the pilot's voice, twisting Keller's commands into incomprehensible noise. Panic clawed at her throat, but she swallowed it down, switching frequencies, rechecking connections, every movement precise though her fingers shook. The interference grew worse, bleeding across channels, a surge of white noise that threatened to sever the lifeline. She felt the weight of the team's lives pressing on her in that instant, the realization that if she failed to clear the signal, they would be blind, cut off, helpless. Keller's eyes burned into her, silent but commanding, trusting her to fix it. And she did. Her hands moved with desperate calm, adjusting dials, flipping switches, rerouting connections until the static thinned, the pilot's voice cutting back through like light piercing a storm. Relief surged through her, but she did not let it break her focus. She transmitted again, clear and precise, as though nothing had faltered, as though she had never been on the edge of failure. The chain held. The mission continued. And Keller, though he said nothing, let the faintest shadow of approval cross his face, a silent acknowledgement that the rookie had just wrestled with chaos and won. The convoy slipped further into the desert, and Command made the decision to hold strikes until a more advantageous position emerged. The aircraft withdrew to higher altitude, the team maintained observation, and Elena remained the unbroken voice between them. Hours later, when the sun finally burned over the horizon and Command ordered the team to exfiltrate, Elena was trembling with exhaustion, her body hollowed by the effort, but her spirit alive with the knowledge of what she had endured. She had not only marched, not only observed, but had carried the weight of coordination under pressure that could have crushed her. The team broke down their post, moving once again across the endless sand, their silence heavier but warmer, a silence that now included her rather than excluding her. When they reached the extraction point and collapsed into the waiting vehicle, Elena allowed herself a moment to close her eyes, the roar of engines carrying her away. She was no longer the rookie who had merely survived the march. She was now the operator who had faced interference, chaos, and responsibility, and had not broken. Respect was not just given, it was carved, meter by meter, word by word, into the hard stone of the desert. And she was carving her place into it with every breath. The desert had a way of reshaping time, of stretching hours into eternity and compressing days into fleeting moments, and Elena soon discovered that life with the combat control team was measured less by calendars than by missions. Rest at the forward site was always temporary, an interlude between movements, and though her body screamed for more than a few hours of sleep, she learned quickly to seize rest in fragments, to eat quickly, to prepare equipment with obsessive thoroughness. There was no space here for comfort, no indulgence in weakness, because every man around her lived with the unspoken truth that tomorrow might demand more than today had given. The shift in how the team regarded her became tangible in those intervals. Where once she had been ignored, she now received small but telling signs. Someone passing her a canteen without being asked, a quiet word of reminder before movement, the absence of skepticism in their eyes when she shouldered her radio. Respect in this world was not displayed with loud gestures but with subtle acts of inclusion, and Elena cherished every one. Still, she remained conscious that a single failure could unravel all she had built, and so she carried herself with vigilance, her mind taut like the wire of her headset, always listening, always ready. It was during one such interlude, the pale dawn still bleeding across the canyon walls, when Keller summoned her aside. His face was as unreadable as ever, a mask carved by years of command, but his eyes fixed on her with the deliberate weight of a leader who had already measured her progress. "Tonight," he said, his voice low, gravel pressed into syllables, "you're not just relaying. You'll be running the net." The word struck her with both exhilaration and dread. Running the net meant she would be the central hub of communications, managing not only the link to command but also coordinating between the aircraft, ground elements, and Keller's own directives. It was a role usually entrusted only to seasoned operators, the kind of responsibility that could overwhelm even veterans. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod, her voice steady when she answered, "Yes, Sergeant." Keller studied her a moment longer as if searching for cracks, then simply said, "Don't freeze. Don't falter." With that, he turned away, leaving Elena with the echo of his words and the pounding of her own heart. The mission brief unfolded swiftly thereafter. Intelligence indicated that hostile forces were amassing near a wadi, preparing supply routes that would funnel weapons deeper into contested territory. The CCT was to infiltrate, confirm movement, and if necessary, guide airstrikes to disrupt operations. It was a task layered with uncertainty, the kind of mission where a single mistake could spiral into disaster. Elena listened intently, her pen scratching across her notebook, recording frequencies, call signs, timing windows. The more she wrote, the steadier she became, grounding herself in the precision of details. Knowledge was her anchor, and in the flood of nerves she clung to it. By dusk, the team was moving again, their silhouettes swallowed by the desert's expanse, boots grinding against stone, breath rising in faint clouds as the air cooled. Elena carried the weight of the radio as always, but tonight it felt heavier, infused with the gravity of her new role. Yet she did not falter. Step by step, she reminded herself that she had earned her place here, that Keller would not have entrusted her with this responsibility if he believed she would crumble. Hours passed in silence as they wound their way toward the wadi, the terrain jagged and unforgiving, the night thick with shadows that seemed to shift with every gust of wind. Elena forced her focus outward, memorizing landmarks, noting their position against her map, ensuring she could recalibrate if comms faltered again. When at last they reached the overlook, the team melted into position with the precision of long practice, scopes trained on the valley below where faint lights flickered like embers in the dark. Elena settled into her post, headset snug, notebook open, frequencies humming through her radio. She keyed into command, her voice crisp as she reported their position, and the acknowledgement came back instantly, a lifeline tethering them across the distance. One by one, she checked in with the aircraft assigned to the window, her words calm, deliberate, her cadence professional. It felt surreal, commanding the net, hearing the steady responses of pilots who trusted her voice to guide them. Her nerves still throbbed beneath the surface, but with each successful transmission, confidence layered itself over fear, until she felt less like the rookie and more like the operator she had long trained to be. The hours that followed tested every ounce of that confidence. Movement stirred below, vehicles, shadows of men, the unmistakable silhouettes of weapons. Elena's pen raced as she logged details, her voice relaying updates with precision. The aircraft circled above, their presence invisible but reassuring, each check-in reminding her that she was not alone in the task. Keller crouched beside her at intervals, feeding her coordinates, his voice low and certain, and she translated them flawlessly into transmissions. The tension was palpable, a wire stretched thin across the valley, but she did not waver. And then, just as the situation seemed under control, chaos erupted. The fighters below fired flares into the sky, a sudden burst of light that illuminated the ridgeline where the team lay hidden. Shouts echoed across the valley, engines roared to life, and gunfire crackled into the night. The enemy had seen them. In an instant, the silent observation transformed into survival. Bullets tore into the rocks around them, sending shards of stone splintering into the air. The team flattened, returning fire in disciplined bursts, their movements precise even under the storm. Elena's heart thundered in her chest, but her hands moved with purpose, keying into the net, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Troops in contact, grid coordinates," she transmitted with flawless cadence, relaying Keller's commands even as the ground shook with impacts. The aircraft responded immediately, their voices calm, and within minutes the roar of engines dipped lower, weapons armed. Elena coordinated with a clarity she had not known she possessed, her voice unbroken even as adrenaline surged through her veins. She tracked the positions, adjusted for movement, relayed Keller's corrections. Her words guided steel and fire from the sky, and when the first strike tore into the valley floor, the night lit up with thunder. Explosions echoed off the canyon walls, the convoy scattering, fighters fleeing in panic. Still, the danger was far from over. The enemy, though scattered, pressed fire toward the ridge, rounds cracking dangerously close. Elena ducked behind cover, her radio pressed tight, her voice steady as she coordinated the next run. The pilots trusted her, adjusting on her calls, and one by one the enemy's positions were shredded under precise strikes. Dust and smoke filled the air, the valley consumed by chaos, yet the team held firm, their discipline unshaken. Elena felt the weight of every word, every correction, as though the lives of the men beside her were tied directly to her voice. And in a way they were. She had become the bridge not only between ground and sky but between survival and defeat, and the realization sharpened her focus into something diamond-hard. There was no room for fear. Only precision. Only discipline. Only duty. The firefight stretched into long minutes that felt like eternity, but at last the valley fell silent. The enemy had been broken, their convoy shattered, survivors scattering into the desert. The aircraft circled once more, confirming no further movement, and Elena relayed the all-clear with a voice that trembled only after the transmission ended. Around her, the team began to regroup, their movements efficient despite the dust, their weapons lowered but ready. Keller approached, his face streaked with grit, his eyes steady as they fixed on her. For a long moment, he said nothing, only studying her as though weighing the sum of her actions. Then finally he spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of truth. "You ran it clean. Not many could have." The words sank into her like water into parched earth, quenching something she had long thirsted for. She nodded, too exhausted to respond, but her chest swelled with pride. She had not only survived. She had commanded the net under fire, and the respect she had sought was no longer tentative but solid, carved in the crucible of combat. The exfiltration was grueling, every step through the desert heavy with fatigue, every nerve frayed by the aftermath of adrenaline. Elena stumbled more than once, her body near collapse, but the men around her did not let the distance widen. One offered a steadying hand, another adjusted her pack when the straps dug too deep. These were gestures she would never forget, proof that she had been accepted not as a burden but as one of them. By the time they reached the extraction point and collapsed into the waiting vehicle, the horizon was bleeding with dawn. Elena sat in silence, her headset still hanging around her neck, her body trembling from exhaustion. Keller sat across from her, and this time there was no mask, no unreadable barrier in his eyes. There was only respect, pure and unspoken, the kind that could not be faked or forced. And as the vehicle rumbled away from the wadi, Elena allowed herself a rare smile, knowing that she had taken another step forward, another meter in the endless march of proving herself. The rookie was gone. In her place stood the operator who had commanded the net and held the line when the desert itself seemed determined to break her. The days after the firefight at the wadi blurred together, marked by long hours of recovery and the ceaseless demands of preparation. Elena found herself caught between exhaustion and exhilaration, her body worn down but her spirit sharper than ever. She had felt the desert test her, had tasted the metallic tang of fear in her throat, and yet she had not broken. The respect she had earned from the team was now tangible, woven into every subtle gesture, the way they made room for her at the table without hesitation, the way they no longer second-guessed her presence when Keller issued assignments. Even the quietest among them, men hardened by years of service and accustomed to treating rookies with wary distance, now treated her as part of the chain, no weaker or less reliable than the rest. For Elena, the change was intoxicating but also sobering, because she knew respect was not a trophy to be displayed but a weight to be carried. She had proven herself once, twice, but in this world, each day demanded proof anew. Keller, for his part, did not indulge in praise. He never spoke more than necessary, his approval hidden behind the gruff mask of leadership, but Elena began to notice the ways he tested her. He would call for radio checks without warning, ask her to relay updates in the middle of exhaustion, hand her details faster than any normal operator could log as if daring her to falter. And though her pen sometimes shook, though sweat sometimes stung her eyes, she never gave him the satisfaction of failure. She answered each test with precision, refusing to let the smallest crack show. In those moments, she came to understand that Keller's silence was not indifference but respect in its own right, the kind reserved for those he believed might be capable of enduring the same crucible he had once faced. She clung to that understanding, using it as fuel when fatigue gnawed at her bones or when doubt whispered that she would never truly belong. It was during one of those relentless drills that the next mission was handed down, and it would prove to be unlike any they had faced before. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a courier who carried not weapons but information, documents and data drives that mapped the supply lines across the region. Capturing him could cripple the enemy's operations, but he was careful, slippery, always moving under cover, always surrounded by loyal fighters. The CCT was tasked with intercepting his convoy as it crossed a narrow stretch of desert, coordinating with a separate ground unit that would close the net. For Elena, the mission carried new weight. It was not enough simply to observe or to relay. She would be the nexus through which two separate forces communicated, her words binding them into a single strike. The pressure was immense, and though her hands remained steady as she copied the briefing into her notebook, her chest burned with the knowledge of what failure would mean. If her timing faltered, if her precision slipped, the convoy could vanish, the courier escape, the mission collapse. The march began under moonlight, as so many before had, the team moving with steady, relentless rhythm across the sand. Elena's pack felt heavier than usual, though she knew it was only the burden of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She forced her mind to stay calm, reciting frequencies in silence, visualizing the timing of each check-in, rehearsing in her head the words she would use. She had learned in these weeks that fear could not be banished, but it could be harnessed, sharpened into focus if wielded correctly. So she welcomed the fear, carried it with her like a blade, and let it slice away distraction. By the time they reached their vantage point overlooking the narrow stretch of desert, she was ready. Her equipment unfolded with practiced precision, her hands moving swiftly, her headset snug. She checked in with command, then with the ground unit advancing from another direction, then with the aircraft on standby overhead. The net was alive, threads of voices woven together through her, and for the first time she felt not like a single operator but like the center of a vast web, each strand vibrating with tension. Hours crawled by as they waited, the desert silent except for the whisper of wind. Elena kept her focus sharp, relaying quiet updates, logging positions, ensuring the net never wavered. Fatigue pressed at her eyes, but she fought it down with clenched determination. And then at last the convoy appeared. Dust plumed faintly in the distance, headlights muted against the darkness, the low rumble of engines carrying across the sand. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm as she transmitted the first sighting, her words sharp, precise. Command responded instantly, the ground unit acknowledged, the aircraft tightened their orbit. The net was alive now, humming with anticipation, and Elena was its heartbeat. Keller crouched beside her, feeding her details in terse whispers, and she translated them seamlessly into transmissions. The convoy drew closer, the tension stretched tighter, and she felt as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Then the unexpected happened. A secondary convoy appeared from the opposite direction, larger than the first, its vehicles bristling with armed fighters. The intelligence brief had made no mention of reinforcements, and the sudden development threatened to unravel the entire operation. Keller's eyes narrowed as he assessed the scene, his hand tapping against his rifle in silent calculation. The ground unit would be outnumbered if they engaged blindly, the aircraft risked hitting the wrong target if coordinates blurred, and the courier could vanish in the chaos. In that instant, the success of the mission hinged on clarity, on coordination, on Elena's ability to bind every piece together without falter. Her throat tightened, her pulse hammered, but she forced her focus into razor sharpness. She relayed the update with flawless cadence, her words precise, her voice unbroken. She guided the aircraft to track the second convoy, adjusted the ground unit's timing, and kept command updated with the unfolding complexity. Her pen raced across her notebook, her fingers steady on the dials, her voice the calm center of the storm. The battle that followed was chaos sculpted into strategy. The ground unit struck first, ambushing the lead vehicles of the courier's convoy. Gunfire erupted, shattering the desert silence, tracers streaking across the night. Elena relayed updates with relentless clarity, her voice never wavering even as the valley below ignited with violence. The aircraft swooped low, unleashing precise strikes on the reinforcements, explosions ripping into the sand, vehicles erupting in flames. Through it all, Elena remained the lifeline, her headset buzzing with voices, her words threading them together. She tracked positions, adjusted coordinates, corrected timing. She was no longer merely the rookie operator who once stumbled through training. She was the axis on which the mission turned. Keller barked updates and she caught every word, translating them into clear transmissions. The pilots trusted her cadence, the ground unit trusted her precision, and in the crucible of that firefight, she became the anchor that held the operation together. Minutes stretched into eternity, but at last the tide turned. The reinforcements were shattered under combined fire, the courier's convoy crippled, survivors scattering into the desert. Keller confirmed visual on the target captured by the ground unit, and Elena transmitted the success with a steadiness that masked the thunder in her chest. Relief surged through her, but she did not allow it to break her focus until the final all-clear was given, until every voice on the net confirmed safety. Only then did she sag slightly against her pack, her throat raw, her hands trembling from the intensity. Around her the team regrouped, their faces streaked with